Elias Thorne considered the rain a personal insult. It fell in a cold, relentless sheet, turning the November dirt of his derelict farm into a slick, unforgiving mud. The water soaked through the thin fabric of his jacket, chilling him not just to the bone, but to the very marrow where the ghosts lived. He stood on the crumbling porch, watching the world dissolve into a gray watercolor painting of misery, a perfect reflection of the landscape inside his own skull. This farm, his family's legacy, was a graveyard of failures. Rusted tractors slumped in the tall weeds like forgotten metal beasts, their engines seized and silent. The barn leaned at a drunken angle, its roof a patchwork of holes that let the insulting rain in. He was just another piece of broken equipment left to rust. 5 years. 5 years since the blast in Kandahar had ripped his world apart, taking his team, his career, and the part of his soul that knew how to feel anything other than this hollow ache. They'd send him home from the Navy SEALs with a box of medals, a scarred face, and a brain rewired for a war that never ended. The quiet of civilian life was the most deafening sound he had ever known. It gave the memories room to breathe, to whisper, and then to scream. He remembered the pressure wave first, a physical blow that felt like the hand of God slapping him into the dirt. He remembered the dust, thick and chalky, tasting of iron and cordite. Most of all, he remembered Loki, his Belgian Malinois, his partner. He remembered the dog's intelligent brown eyes looking back at him an instant before the world went white, a look of calm professional trust that haunted him more than any human face. He had sworn an oath over Loki's memory, a silent bitter vow. Never again, no more dogs, no more partners to lose. A sound cut through the drone of the rain. It was thin, reedy, and pathetic. A whimper. Elias's first instinct was to ignore it. The world was full of whimpering things. He was one of them. It was not his problem. He turned to go back inside the cold, empty house, back to the company of a bottle of cheap whiskey, and the silent judgment of his fallen comrades. But the sound came again, sharper this time, a spike of pure misery that pierced the thick blanket of his apathy. It was a sound he knew. It was the sound of a soldier in pain. Against his better judgment, he pulled his collar up against the rain and stomped down the muddy path toward the front gate. The hinges groaned in protest as he neared, the rusted metal screaming like a tortured soul. And there, chained to the gatepost, was the source of the sound. A German shepherd, so emaciated its ribs stood out in sharp relief against its wet, matted fur. Its head was down, its body trembling uncontrollably, a portrait of utter defeat. A deep infected gash ran along its flank, oozing a sickly fluid that mingled with the rain and mud. A length of heavy rusted chain was cinched cruelly around its neck, connected to the gate. Pinned to the post by a hunting knife was a piece of cardboard, the words scrawled in angry black marker bleeding in the downpour. Your problem now. Elias felt a familiar, cold rage begin to smolder in his gut. This was the casual cruelty of the world he had tried to leave behind, the kind of pointless malice that made him question if anything was worth fighting for. He crouched down, the cold mud soaking through the knee of his jeans. He expected a growl, a show of teeth. He got nothing. The dog didn't even lift its head. It just lay there, accepting the rain, the chain, the pain. Elias moved slowly, his hands held out where the dog could see them. Easy, boy, he murmured, the words feeling foreign and rusty in his throat. He hadn't spoken to anything but the cashier at the liquor store in months. He reached the dog's head and stopped. The animal finally lifted its gaze, and in that moment, Elias Thorne's carefully constructed fortress of solitude crumbled into dust. The dog's eyes were a deep, intelligent amber, but they were vacant. They held the same flat, distant emptiness he saw in his own reflection every morning. The 1,000-yard stare. It was the look of a soul that had seen too much, endured too much, and had nothing left to give. He wasn't looking at an animal. He was looking in a mirror. He was looking at a fellow veteran, abandoned on a forgotten battlefield. The vow he had made to Loki shattered. This was not a choice. It was a command. He returned from the barn with a pair of heavy bolt cutters, the steel cold and heavy in his hands. All right, soldier, he said, his voice low and steady, the command tone of a team leader taking over. Let's get you off this wire. The chain snapped with a sharp crack that sounded like a distant sniper rifle. The dog flinched but made no other move. It was too weak to stand. Elias slid his arms gently under the dog's surprisingly light frame, lifting the sack of bones and fur into his arms. The dog let out a small, pained sigh but didn't struggle. It was as if it had already surrendered to whatever fate came next. As Elias carried his new burden back toward the house, the rain began to let up, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking alone. Inside, the house was just as cold as it was outside. He laid the dog down on a threadbare rug in front of the stone fireplace, a hearth that hadn't seen a fire in years. He brought back an old army blanket, his hands working with an instinctual gentleness he thought he'd lost. He cleaned the gash on the dog's side with antiseptic from his own first aid kit, his fingers probing the wound with a practiced touch. The dog watched him with those haunting eyes, tracking his every move, but remained perfectly still. Elias found a can of stew in the back of his cupboard and warmed it on the stove. the smell filling the sterile air of the kitchen. He put a small amount in a bowl and set it down. The dog sniffed it once, then began to eat with a slow, deliberate desperation that spoke of days or weeks of starvation. The next morning, the gray light revealed the full extent of the dog's neglect, but it also revealed something else, a quiet dignity. The dog had dragged itself to the door during the night, a clear sign of house training. As Elias cleaned up the mud and water from the day before he watched the animal, there was an economy to its movements, even in its weakened state. It didn't waste energy. It observed, it processed. This was no ordinary stray. His observation was interrupted by the sound of a rattling engine and tires spitting gravel. A battered pickup truck, its paint peeling and one fender a different color, roared up his driveway and screeched to a halt. A man climbed out, a paunchy, red-faced individual with mean little eyes and a stained baseball cap. Elias recognized him, Jed Miller, a local parasite known for his short temper and a string of petty crimes that never quite stuck. Jed stomped onto the porch without invitation. "Heard you found my property," he snarled, gesturing with his thumb toward the house. "That's my dog." Useless mutt ran off. "I'll be taking him back." Elias stepped out of the doorway, blocking the entrance. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his 6'2" frame filling the space, his arms crossed over his chest. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he'd learned in interrogation rooms half a world away. Jed shifted his weight, his bluster starting to fade under Elias's cold, unblinking stare. "Look, I paid good money for him. He ain't a fighter. Worthless. But he's still mine." "He was chained to my gate," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A verdict. "Yeah, well, I knew you'd take care of him," Jed stammered, his lie thin and pathetic. "Now give him back." Elias took one slow step forward. He did nothing overtly threatening. He didn't clench his fists or raise his voice. He simply closed the distance. His eyes locked on Jed's. In that moment, the broken farmer vanished, replaced by the apex predator he had once been. Jed saw it. The bully, accustomed to intimidating the weak, suddenly found himself in the presence of something ancient and lethal. He saw the promise of swift, efficient, and devastating violence in Elias's stillness. Jed's face went pale. He took a stumbling step back, then another. "Forget it," Jed spat, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. "You can have the stupid mutt." He scrambled back into his truck, spraying mud and gravel as he peeled out of the driveway, fleeing as if the devil himself were on his heels. Elias watched him go, the cold rage receding, leaving only the familiar emptiness. He turned and went back inside. The dog was on its feet, standing unsteadily in the middle of the room, watching the door. It looked at Elias, and for the first time, there was something other than despair in its eyes. It was a flicker of questioning, of appraisal. Elias nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me too." He decided to call him Kaiser. It was a strong name, a name for a king or a warrior. Over the next week, a quiet routine settled over the farm. Elias fed Kaiser, cleaned his wound, and took him for short, slow walks around the property. Kaiser, in turn, began to heal. The light returned to his eyes, and he started to fill out, his magnificent German shepherd frame re-emerging from beneath the skin and bones. He followed Elias everywhere, a silent, watchful shadow. The oppressive silence of the house was replaced by the soft patting of paws on the wood floor, the gentle sigh of the dog sleeping by the fire Elias now lit every night. Elias found himself talking to the dog, telling him stories about the farm, about his team, about Loki. The words came easier than they ever had with any therapist. One evening, while gently checking the healing gash on Kaiser's flank, Elias noticed something he'd missed before. A small, faded tattoo on the inside of the dog's ear. It wasn't the jumble of a breeder's mark. It was a precise alphanumeric code. His blood ran cold. He knew that format. He had seen it on every piece of sensitive equipment, every classified file, every military working dog he had ever served with. It was a Department of Defense identification tattoo. This dog wasn't just trained. He was government property. The revelation changed everything. This wasn't just about a man saving a stray. This was something far more complicated. He knew he couldn't ignore it. Kaiser deserved to have his story known, his service honored, and Elias needed to know who had done this to a fellow soldier. The nearest town had one veterinarian, a small clinic run by a Dr. Eris Thorne. Elias loaded Kaiser into his old truck, the dog hopping into the passenger seat as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. Dr. Thorne was a woman whose sharp, intelligent eyes seemed to take in everything at once. She was initially wary of Elias's grim appearance and the powerful dog at his side. Her expression was professional but distant as he explained how he'd found Kaiser. But as she began her examination, her demeanor softened. She saw the way Elias spoke to the dog in a low, calming murmur. She saw the way Kaiser, despite his obvious strength, was completely at ease, trusting this scarred, silent man implicitly. "He's been through a lot," she said, her fingers gently probing the now healing wound. "But you've done a good job with him. This could have gone septic." She took out a scanner. "Let's see if he has a microchip. Might tell us where he came from." She ran the scanner over Kaiser's shoulders. It beeped. Well, we have a chip, she said, looking at her tablet. Her brow furrowed. That's strange. What is it? Elias asked, his gut tightening. It's encrypted, heavily. Military grade, by the looks of it, she said, tapping at the screen. My system can't read the data, but it did trigger something. It just sent an automated alert to a Department of Defense server. She looked up at Elias, her expression serious. Whoever this dog belongs to, they're important, and they don't like to lose their property. You might have just stepped into something very, very big. Her surname was Thorne, too. He noted the coincidence but filed it away. It didn't seem important, not yet. The drive back to the farm was quiet. Kaiser seemed to sense the shift in Elias's mood, resting his head on the man's thigh, a silent gesture of support. The warning from Dr. Thorne echoed in his mind. He was a ghost. He wasn't supposed to be on anyone's radar. Now he had sent up a flare. A few days passed in tense silence. The bond between man and dog deepened. Elias found himself working on the farm, not out of necessity, but out of a renewed sense of purpose. He mended a stretch of broken fence. He cleared the weeds from his mother's old garden. With every swing of the axe, every nail hammered home, he felt like he was repairing a small piece of himself. Kaiser was always there, supervising from a patch of shade or helping by fetching a dropped tool. The emptiness inside Elias was still there, but it wasn't a gaping void anymore. It had a warm, breathing, loyal companion sitting in the middle of it. Then they came. It was dusk when the black SUV, silent as a shark, rolled down his driveway. It was out of place in this rural landscape, too clean, too expensive, too predatory. Two men got out. They weren't cops or soldiers. They wore clean, sterile tactical pants and black polo shirts with no logos. They moved with a fluid, disciplined grace that screamed private military. Professionals. The leader was a man with cold, empty eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Elias met them on the porch, with Kaiser standing silently at his side, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Elias Thorne, the leader asked. It wasn't a question. Elias just nodded. My name is Stryker. We're here for the asset, he said, his gaze flicking to Kaiser. He is proprietary technology belonging to our client. We're here to retire him. The word retire hung in the air, cold and final. They were here to kill him. He's not an asset, Elias said, his voice flat and hard as stone. He's a soldier, and he's not going anywhere. Stryker sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. Mr. Thorne, you are a decorated veteran. We respect that. But you are interfering with a matter of national security. The canine is a product of a defunct DARPA program. He is unstable. A risk. Give him to us, and we walk away. No one needs to know you were harboring him. Elias looked down at Kaiser, who looked back up, his trust absolute. He thought of Loki. He thought of his team. He thought of the oath he had taken to never leave a man behind. This dog was no different. You're going to have to go through me, Elias said quietly. Stryker's patience evaporated. So be it. He and his partner moved, fast and coordinated. They didn't draw weapons. They clearly intended to handle this quietly. They underestimated him. They saw a broken farmer, not a Tier 1 operator. It was a fatal mistake. The dormant killer inside Elias woke up. As the first man reached the porch steps, Elias kicked a loose plank. The wood flew up, catching the man under the chin with a sickening crack. As he staggered back, Elias was already moving, a blur of motion. He used the porch column for leverage, launching himself at the second man, Stryker. The fight was a brutal, close-quarters ballet of violence. Elias wasn't just fighting. He was using his home as a weapon. He slammed Stryker into a rotted support beam, the wood splintering. He used the terrain, the mud, the shadows. The first contractor recovered, pulling a combat knife. He lunged at Elias from behind, but he forgot about the second soldier on the field. Kaiser exploded into action. He didn't bark. He didn't snarl. He moved with silent, lethal precision, a black and tan missile. He hit the man's arm with the full force of his body, his jaws locking onto the bicep in a perfect, trained takedown bite. The man screamed, the knife clattering to the ground. The momentary distraction was all Elias needed. He disarmed Stryker and delivered a series of precise, debilitating blows, ending the fight in seconds. Stryker lay groaning on the ground, his partner cradling a mangled arm. Kaiser stood over the downed man, not growling, but simply holding him, waiting for his next command. Elias looked at the scene, his breathing heavy, the adrenaline singing in his veins. The war had come home. Stryker, bleeding from a cut on his head, managed to get to his feet. He gave Elias a look of pure hatred. This isn't over, he hissed, helping his partner limp back to the SUV. They sped away, leaving Elias and Kaiser alone in the gathering dark. Elias knew they would be back, and they would bring guns next time. The farmhouse was no longer a sanctuary, it was a target. He had only one call to make, one lifeline to a world he had abandoned. He went inside, Kaiser padding silently behind him, and dialed a number he hadn't used in 5 years. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar, authoritative voice answered. Jacobs, Commander, Elias said, the word feeling strange on his tongue. It's Thorne. I'm in trouble. He explained everything, his voice calm and concise, delivering a situation report as if he were still in the field. The dog, the tattoo, the contractors, the fight. Commander Jacobs listened without interruption. When Elias finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Son, what have you gotten yourself into? Jacobs finally said, his voice laced with concern. A DARPA dog? Those projects were buried deep. Stay put. Don't go anywhere. I'll make some calls. I'm on my way. The hours that followed were the longest of Elias's life. He sat by the window, a shotgun across his lap, Kaiser at his feet. Every sound, every shadow was a potential threat. He was back in the war zone, but this time he wasn't alone. Jacobs called back 2 hours later. His voice was grim. I've got something, Thorne. It's not good. The program was called Project Cerberus. They were trying to create the next generation of military working dogs, genetically engineered for intelligence, strength, loyalty. The program was a catastrophic failure. The dogs were too intelligent, too individual. They bonded too strongly with their handlers. When a handler was lost, the dogs became unresponsive, effectively useless to anyone else. The program was shut down, and the assets were ordered to be decommissioned, euthanized. Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones. So they were just going to kill them all? Quietly, Jacobs confirmed. The private firm that developed the gene sequencing, a company called Aegis Tactical, was hired to clean up their own mess. That's who your friend Stryker works for. They can't have a piece of their billion-dollar technology running around in public. Jacobs paused. Elias. There's more. I pulled the dog's file using the ID number from that vet. His designation was Cerberus K9 Unit 7, and I pulled his handler's file. Another pause, this one heavier than the last. Elias, the handler's name was Corporal David Thorne. The world tilted on its axis. David, his younger brother, the bright, smiling kid who had followed him into the service, joining the Marines while Elias was in the SEALs. They had lost touch, the distance of deployments, and Elias's own self-imposed exile creating a chasm between them. He knew David had been killed 2 years ago. A training accident, they'd said. A vehicle rollover on a base in California. No, Elias whispered, the word a strangled breath. No, that's not possible. The official report is a lie, son, Jacob said, his voice soft with pity. David wasn't in a vehicle. He was killed during a live fire exercise. A catastrophic equipment failure. The whole thing was covered up by Aegis and their pet general to protect the program. Kaiser? Unit 7, he was there. He was David's partner. The pieces slammed together with the force of a physical blow. The dog wasn't just a stray. He wasn't just a fellow soldier. He was a message from his dead brother. He was the last living link to a family Elias had let slip away. Jed Miller, the local bully, must have been a low-level kennel worker at one of Aegis's holding facilities, stealing a high-value dog he couldn't handle and then dumping him. And the vet, Eris Thorne. It wasn't a coincidence. David had mentioned a cousin in his last letter, a cousin who was studying to be a vet. She must have moved here after his death, trying to be close to the last of her family. Elias looked down at Kaiser. The dog whined softly and nudged his hand, sensing the storm of grief and rage brewing inside him. All the pain Elias had been suppressing for years for his team, for Loki, and now, with crushing weight, for the brother he never got to say goodbye to, erupted. A raw, ragged sob tore from his throat. He wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck and wept, mourning all the ghosts that haunted his broken farm. Just before dawn, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching broke the silence. But it wasn't the quiet hum of an SUV. It was the heavy rumble of military trucks. Elias stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, Kaiser by his side, ready to make his last stand. The trucks pulled up, and Commander Jacobs stepped out, flanked by armed military police. At the same time, a black SUV came tearing down the road, Stryker and a half-dozen more Aegis contractors spilling out, armed for war. Stand down, Thorne, Stryker yelled. That is corporate property. They're on federal land, Captain? Jacobs boomed, his voice carrying the weight of command. And you are in violation of a dozen federal laws. Aegis Tactical is under investigation for fraud and a criminal cover-up. You and your men are under arrest. The MPs moved in, and Stryker's men, faced with overwhelming legitimate force, dropped their weapons. The war was over. But the battle wasn't. A few days later, after the dust had settled, a new threat arrived. Not a man with a gun, but a man in a crisp suit, carrying a briefcase. A Tier 3 antagonist. The bureaucrat. He represented the Department of Defense. Mr. Thorne, the man said, his voice devoid of emotion. We appreciate your assistance in this matter. However, the asset, K9 Unit 7, remains the property of the United States government. He is classified. He will be taken into permanent custody at a secure facility. Elias felt the hope that had begun to bloom wither and die. He had won the fight, only to lose to a stack of paperwork. He was standing in the yard, arguing fruitlessly with the man, when another old truck pulled into the driveway. It was his father. He hadn't seen him in over a year. An old, stooped man with Elias's eyes, filled with a sadness he never knew how to express. I heard what happened, his father said, his voice raspy. He was holding a small dusty box. I should have come sooner. I never knew how to, after you came back. He held out the box. These were David's. Elias opened it. Inside were photos, a few medals, and a stack of letters. On top was one addressed to him but never sent. His hands trembled as he read it. David's familiar scrawl spoke of his new partner, a brilliant dog he called K, short for Kaiser. He wrote about how he hoped Elias would meet him one day, how the three of them could fix up the old farm together when they were all out of the service. At that moment, Commander Jacobs arrived, having driven back from the base. He saw the letter in Elias's hand, the bureaucrat standing stiffly nearby. He read the letter, his expression hardening. He turned to the man in the suit. "This dog is a hero," Jacobs declared. He was the partner of a United States Marine who was killed in the line of duty due to the criminal negligence this man, he gestured to Elias, helped expose. He's also the last living connection that a wounded warrior has to his fallen brother. You can write in your report that on my authority as a commanding officer, K9 Unit 7 is being officially and honorably discharged and rehomed as a companion animal for a veteran with post-traumatic stress. If the Pentagon has a problem with that, they can take it up with me personally. The bureaucrat, faced with a decorated commander and a mountain of politically disastrous optics, simply nodded, packed his briefcase, and left. 1 year later, the November rain was falling again. But this time it wasn't an insult, it was a cleansing. It washed over a farm that was no longer derelict. The fences were mended. The barn stood straight and true, its roof solid. A warm yellow light glowed from the windows of the house, which wore a fresh coat of paint. In the yard, Elias Thorne threw a tennis ball. He was still scarred, but the ghost was gone from his eyes. They were clear and calm. Kaiser, a picture of health and happiness, bounded after the ball, his powerful legs eating up the ground. Dr. Eris Thorne watched from the porch, a warm smile on her face. She came by for dinner most Sundays now. She and Elias and his father, a small, cobbled-together family, healing old wounds around the dinner table. Kaiser dropped the ball at Elias's feet, his tail wagging furiously. Elias picked it up, his hand rubbing the dog's head. He looked at his home, his family, his partner. He had found his peace, not by running from the ghosts of his past, but by finally giving them a home. He wound up and threw the ball again, and as the magnificent dog leaped into the air to catch it, Elias Thorne, for the first time since before the war, threw back his head and laughed. The sound was rich and full and free.